It had been 6 months since the funeral. 6 months since we lowered him into the ground under the gray rain and promised ourselves we'd move on. But that night in the basement, the promise broke. The air was damp, the kind that clung to your throat. Lily brushed dust off an old cassette deck, her hands trembling. A label written in Dad's crooked handwriting, "For my kids, 1998. None of us spoke. Ethan plugged it in. The machine gave a dry click, then a soft hiss like something breathing. And then, "Don't let this house divide you." It was his voice. My father's voice. The room froze. Ethan's eyes darted to mine. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. The basement light flickered once, a faint pulse from the ceiling, as if the house itself had exhaled. "Did the lights just—" Ethan whispered. No one answered. The air turned colder, sharp enough to sting the skin. A faint hum crept through the old pipes, low and uneven, as if the house had a pulse of its own. Lily stepped back, her heel brushing against Dad's old toolbox. Something metallic fell, a single screwdriver hitting the concrete with a hollow ring. None of us moved to pick it up. Ethan swallowed hard. "It's just electricity," he muttered. "Old wiring." But even his voice sounded rehearsed, like he didn't believe himself. No one believed him, not even the light. The cassette kept turning. Every second ticked louder, and with each turn the hiss grew heavier, like static mixed with breathing. Somewhere above us, a door creaked open on its own. We all looked up, listening to a silence that suddenly felt alive. The tape crackled again. The voice returned, lower now, colder. "If you must lie, make sure love is what you're lying for." Daniel's voice broke the silence. That wasn't Dad's cough. For a heartbeat, we didn't breathe. Grief turned fragile in the air, too fragile to hold. And then it wasn't grief anymore. It was fear. The rain outside sounded closer, harder, like footsteps on the roof. The cassette spun slow and steady, whispering something none of us dared to finish listening to. If your father's last words suddenly changed, would you still dare to listen till the end? After the funeral, the house didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like something we were borrowing from memory, from silence. Every step echoed differently, like the place had been waiting to speak again. Dad's shoes still sat by the door. The smell of varnish and old wood clung to the hallway. The lake outside was gray flat as a sheet of metal, the kind of quiet that only comes after storms. Lily stood by the window, her fingers tracing the fog on the glass. Ethan paced behind her, tapping his phone screen like he could text his way out of grief. I lingered near the piano. It was still missing a string middle D, the one Dad refused to fix. He used to say, "That wrong note makes the music human." Now the silence around it felt like a wound that wouldn't close. "Taxes are due next month," Ethan said, voice clipped. "If we sell before winter, we can save on upkeep." Lily turned her tone small but sharp. "You're already talking about selling." "I'm talking about surviving," Ethan snapped. "This place isn't magic, Lily. It's a mortgage." She laughed once, dry, brittle. Dad called it a heartbeat. I stepped between them. "Let's just go through his things first, okay?" But the words barely touched them. The air between my siblings was like static, thin, charged, dangerous. We spent the afternoon sorting boxes in the basement. Dust floated through sunlight like lazy snow. The concrete floor was cold even through my boots. Every shelf was a museum. Tape reels, old mics, cables coiled like sleeping snakes. Lily opened a small wooden box. Inside were old photos, a pocket watch and a cassette labeled in faded ink. "For my kids, 1998. She froze. "Dan, this looks like his handwriting." Ethan leaned over her shoulder. "You think it still works?" The tape inside was dusty but intact. The label peeled at the corners, yellowed with time. I turned it over, half expecting to find another message hidden underneath. There was nothing, just the number 1 written in pen. Lily whispered, "Maybe we should wait." Ethan had already plugged the cassette deck into an outlet near the stairs, the same one Dad used during his lessons. "Wait," I said. "The belt might be dry. Let me." Too late. Ethan pressed play. The motor whirred. A soft hiss filled the room. Then came his voice, warm, gentle, too clear. "My children, if you're hearing this, I hope you remember how we used to sound." Lily gasped. Ethan's mouth fell open. Dad's voice flowed through the old speaker like water over glass. No static, no tape wobble. Perfect clarity. Too perfect. I felt the hairs on my arms lift. Cassette tapes never sound this clean, not after 25 years. Something about it felt processed digital. The background was sterile, no hiss, no hum, not even the faint buzz of Dad's workshop light. It sounded new. Ethan wiped his eyes. God, I forgot how calm he sounded. Lily's voice cracked. It's like he's right here. She reached toward the speaker as if touching it might make him real again. Remember, Dad's voice said, "A home is only as strong as the love that keeps it together." Ethan smiled faintly. See, that's him. But even as he spoke, a chill moved through the room. The sound was warm, but the air wasn't. The basement light flickered again like it had back when the tape first played. I tried to shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the same recording. When the tape clicked off, silence filled the space. No one moved for a long time. Lily whispered, "We should keep it safe." Ethan said, "I'll digitize it, make a clean version." Something in his tone made me uneasy. Clean was exactly what scared me. He carried the tape upstairs like it was a holy object. I watched the stairs swallow him into light. Lily stayed behind, sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding one of Dad's old microphones. "I used to hate this place," she said quietly. "Now it's the only place that still feels alive." I nodded. It still sounds like him. But even as I said it, I knew something about the sound wasn't right. That night I couldn't sleep. Through the floorboards above my room, I heard Ethan replaying the recording, over and over. The voice didn't fade, it sharpened. By the fourth replay, I could swear Dad said something different, a word, a breath, something I couldn't name. But I felt it. Have you ever heard a loved one's voice again and felt something was off? When I was 8, Dad taught us how to record silence. He said real sound wasn't in the noise, it was in the space between. He'd sit us in the basement with the old microphone and whisper, "Don't speak, just listen." You could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator upstairs, the hum of the lake wind pressing against the windows, Lily's breathing next to mine. Then Dad would smile. "You hear that? That's life. You'll miss it when it stops." He made us record everything, our birthdays, piano lessons, even arguments. Ethan used to complain, "Why record fights?" Dad said, "Because one day you'll wish you had proof that you loved each other even when you didn't sound like it." That memory came back the moment I heard his voice on the tape again. Same softness, same rhythm, just without the hiss, without the heartbeat underneath. It sounded like someone had polished a ghost until it gleamed too bright. That night, Lily cooked dinner, roasted chicken, Dad's favorite, but none of us ate much. The house still smelled like candles from the memorial service. Ethan kept his phone by his plate, glancing at work emails between bites. Lily stared at the empty chair at the head of the table. "He'd hate this silence," she said softly. Ethan didn't look up. "He'd hate seeing us drown in it more." "You think selling the house will fix that? I think selling it will stop it from swallowing us." I tried to steer the conversation somewhere safer. "Do you remember the night he recorded Mom singing?" Lily's eyes softened. She was terrible. Ethan laughed for the first time in days, and he said it was perfect. Because it was, I added. He said mistakes were proof we were real. For a moment, the tension lifted. Then Ethan said, "Real or not, the bank doesn't care about proof." The silence that followed was heavier than before. I realized then that grief wasn't dividing us, the house was. Later that night, as I washed the dishes, I noticed the reflection in the kitchen window. The light from the basement flickered again, just once. A small pulse, like a reminder that something below was still awake. We moved into the lake house the summer after Mom died. Dad said the air there would heal us. He called it a place where sound could breathe. I was 10, then still small enough to fit under the piano while he played. Lily would hum along from the couch, always a little off-key, and Ethan would stand by the door pretending not to listen. When Dad hit the broken middle D, he'd smile instead of wince. "As long as we sound like a family," he said, "we are one." For a while it worked. Even the walls seemed to remember laughter. Dad filled reel after reel of tape, birthdays, rainstorms, the sound of us arguing over Monopoly. He said he wanted proof we existed, proof we loved each other even when we didn't sound like it. I didn't understand then that he was already afraid of silence. Ethan left first at 18, chasing college and noise that wasn't ours. Lily stayed. She was always softer, more rooted. I studied audio engineering at a school only an hour away. Dad was proud, but lonely. He'd call at night just to play me recordings through the phone birds outside the window, wind against the shutters, sometimes nothing at all. You hear that he'd whisper, "That's peace trying to stay." By the time I started working, his hands had begun to shake. He couldn't play piano the way he used to. Sometimes I'd find him sitting there pressing one key over and over the wrong one, like he was trying to remind himself that imperfection still meant alive. When his health declined, Lily became his anchor. She called me whenever the power went out or the medication ran low. Ethan called too, but his questions were about taxes, insurance, the will. Dad should name someone executor, he told me once. I remember thinking how strange it was that love always ended up needing paperwork. In those last months, Dad recorded less and listened more. He'd sit by the window with the mic turned on, but never speak. I asked him once what he was waiting for. To see if silence will talk back, he said. One night I helped him move the piano bench closer to the recorder. He looked at me and said, "Don't let this house turn into proof of love. Let it stay, love itself." I didn't know what he meant not until after the funeral, when Ethan started talking about selling it, and Lily refused to pack a single box. After he passed, I found the last tape he ever made, just the sound of rain on the roof and a single note played once gently like a heartbeat. That note was the same broken middle D. He'd never fixed it. Maybe he didn't want to. When Lily found the cassette labeled "For My Kids," 1998, I recognized the handwriting. The ink faded to brown. That was the same year Mom's photo disappeared from the living room shelf, the same year Dad started labeling boxes as if he knew we'd forget. Everything matched except the words on the recording. On the tape, Dad's voice said, "The house belongs to the one who cared for it." But in my memory, he said the opposite. He said love wasn't property, it wasn't proof. I played the memory in my head again and again, testing my own recall the way I test an old track for distortion. Every time I reached that part, my stomach twisted the same way it did the day we buried him. Maybe the tape wasn't just memory. Maybe it was judgment. The night before he passed, I sat beside him as the storm rolled in from the lake. He was too weak to speak, but his fingers tapped faintly against the blanket, 4 slow beats like a rhythm he didn't want to forget. I held the recorder near his chest, not for words, just to keep the sound of him breathing. When the thunder cracked, he opened his eyes once and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Later, when I replayed the tape, all I could make out was a whisper, maybe a sigh, maybe my name. Either way, it felt like goodbye. A week after we first heard the tape, Ethan sent me a link labeled "Clean Version, Final." No message, no explanation, just a single .mp3 file sitting in my inbox like a dare. I put on my headphones and hit play. Dad's voice filled the room again, warm, familiar. And then something new slid in, quiet but unmistakable. "The house belongs to the one who cared for it." I froze. That line hadn't been there before. I remembered every syllable from the cassette, every breath between words. There'd been nothing after, "Don't let this house divide you." Lily was in the kitchen when I told her. She dropped the mug she was holding. It shattered across the floor. "That's not Dad," she said. "He'd never say that." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Maybe he recorded a second version. Maybe you just forgot." I looked at him. "I don't forget sound," he shrugged. "Then maybe Lily did. She had access to the old computer, right?" Her face went pale. "Excuse me." Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling. "The metadata shows the edit came from Lily PC, timestamp from 3 nights ago." "That's impossible," she whispered. "I wasn't even here." The room tightened, walls pushing inward. I checked the file myself. He was right. The signature read, "User Lily." But I also saw a note buried in the waveform, tiny clicks, out-of-place keystrokes. Someone had typed while recording. Ethan jabbed a finger toward her. "You always said the house was Dad's soul. You'd do anything to keep it. I stayed with him because you wouldn't." She shot back. "Oh, please. You turned guilt into ownership." Their voices collided like cymbals, sharp and metallic. I wanted to tell them both to stop, but the noise was part of the story now. Every echo, every accusation feeding something we couldn't name. Lily's eyes glistened. "You think I'd fake his voice? For what? So I can live in a mausoleum." "You already do," Ethan snapped. A picture frame crashed from the wall. The tape deck on the table whirred to life on its own, one of the old reels Dad used. A hiss, then silence. Lily turned on me. You're the sound expert. Tell him it's not me. I opened my mouth, but words refused to come, because I didn't know. We spent the next day pretending not to fight. Ethan worked in the study. Lily stayed upstairs packing small boxes of memories she swore she'd take when this is over. But the air smelled like static, unresolved. I sat in the basement analyzing the digital file frame by frame. At 2:43 in the timeline right before Dad says the disputed line, there's a tiny frequency bump, almost invisible except to someone who listens for ghosts in the waveform. A click. Then a shift in tone that doesn't belong to Dad's mouth. I played it again and again. The hiss rose higher each time, like breath catching between truth and lie. That night, Ethan barged into my room. You find anything? Nothing solid. He smirked. Of course, because there isn't anything. She did it. You don't know that. She's the only one with motive. Motive. She wants the house. It's obvious. I stared at him. You think Dad's voice just changed to fit her agenda? Ethan leaned closer. You think I'm wrong. I think you want to be right. He left without answering. Through the thin wall, I could hear him replaying the clean file on his laptop. Each repetition sounded colder, like the words were turning metallic. By midnight, I heard him whisper along, "The house belongs to the one who cared for it." His tone wasn't relief. It was rehearsal. I couldn't sleep. I opened the original cassette again, pressing play, just to remind myself what truth sounded like. Dad's real voice cracked slightly on Divide, that familiar strain of age and warmth. No perfection, no polish, just him. I compared both versions side by side, channel by channel. One was alive, the other was a mirror. Morning brought more proof, or what looked like proof. In the digital logs, the last user to access the folder was indeed Lily. My chest tightened. Maybe Ethan was right. I printed the log, hands shaking. It felt like betrayal on paper. When Lily came downstairs for coffee, I slid the page toward her. She read it, eyes filling slowly. Dan, I don't even know how to edit audio, but this says, I don't care what it says. I didn't. Her voice broke. She grabbed her coat and walked out into the rain. Ethan watched from the staircase, expression flat. Guilt makes people run. I looked at him, then at the door swinging open and shut with the wind. For the first time, the house sounded empty again. Not silent, just empty. Rain hammered the roof all night, loud enough to drown my thoughts. By morning, Lily still hadn't come back. Ethan acted like he didn't care, coffee, laptop, work, emails, but I could see the tremor in his jaw. He was waiting for her to call, just so he could be right. I spent the day buried in sound waves. Frame by frame, I compared the clean version to the original tape. The more I listened, the more something felt engineered. Frequencies too neat, transitions too seamless. It wasn't just restored, it was rewritten. Still, the logs didn't lie. Edited by Lily PC. The evidence was there, plain as the rain outside. And yet, my gut said otherwise. She couldn't even plug in a microphone correctly without asking for help. How could she have forged a human voice? That night, the house was darker than usual. Ethan shut off the power to save on bills, so I worked under the beam of a single desk lamp. Every sound felt magnified, the rain, the hum of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat in my ears. When I paused the playback, the silence that followed was too clean, almost curated. I tried to call Lily, but it went straight to voicemail. Her last words echoed in my mind. I didn't. She'd sounded more afraid than guilty. Around midnight, I heard footsteps upstairs, Ethan pacing. The same rhythmic pattern, 5 steps, pause, 5 steps. He was talking to himself. When I muted my headphones, I realized he was repeating that cursed line again. The house belongs to the one who cared for it. Each time his voice got steadier, practiced, obsessed. I went upstairs. The door to Dad's old study was half open. Inside, the glow from Ethan's laptop flickered across his face. He had the waveform open on the screen. I recognized it instantly, the same pattern I'd been analyzing. He didn't notice me at first. He was scrubbing through the audio, isolating the voice. Our father's voice. Ethan, I said quietly. He flinched, minimizing the window. What are you doing? Checking the file. Again, he hesitated, then sighed. I just want to understand what she changed. He turned the laptop toward me. A single line of waveform pulsed across the screen. I sent it to a friend, he said. He's restoring it properly this time. Said he can separate the background noise. I felt my stomach twist. You sent Dad's voice to someone else. He's a professional who, freelancer found him online, works with forensic audio. Something about his tone didn't fit. Too casual. You sure you trust this guy? I just want the truth, he said, but his voice had that sharpness again. The same tone he used when winning an argument mattered more than being right. The next day I got an email from an old colleague, Mark, a sound engineer I'd once interned with. The subject line read, "You might want to hear this." Attached was an analysis report. He'd run a spectral scan on the same file Ethan had sent out. His message was short. "Dan, that's not a restoration. It's a reconstruction. Some parts are AI generated. The harmonics don't match human vocal resonance." I stared at the screen, pulse hammering. Half the voice, half of Dad was synthetic, and whoever made it had done so using clean samples from old recordings, blending them with algorithmic patterns. Not restoration. Imitation. I called Mark. "Where did you get this file? It was forwarded to me. Sender's name was Ethan Miller. That's your brother, right?" I didn't answer. My mouth went dry. "Dan." He said quietly, "If your brother's the client, he knew exactly what he was asking for." I hung up. For a long time, I just sat there staring at my hands. The edges of guilt cut deeper than truth. I'd accused Lily, believed Ethan, and now the evidence pointed back at him. When I finally confronted him, he was on the porch watching the rain slide off the railing. "I talked to Mark," I said. He didn't turn around. "So?" "He says the voice isn't real." "Of course it's real," Ethan snapped. "It's Dad. No, Ethan. It's code. Synthesized." He turned then, face pale, lips tight. "You think I did that? I think you sent it to someone who did. I just wanted to clean the file. Then why does it sound new?" The silence that followed was heavy. Wet. Endless. Even the rain seemed to stop listening. Lily's car headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, slicing through the fog. She stepped out soaked, holding a box. "I came back for the rest of Dad's things," she said, voice trembling. Ethan's expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here. This is my home. Not for long." He pulled a folder from his jacket papers. "Sign this. Consent to sell." Lily shook her head. "Dad wouldn't want this. He's gone. Lily, his words are proof. I couldn't hold it in anymore. But whose voice are we hearing?" For a second, no one breathed. Then Ethan whispered, "You don't understand. Then help me." He looked away, jaw tight, eyes wet. But the only answer was the rain, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hiss of a tape beginning to play itself again. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, but the house kept echoing like it hadn't noticed. Drops still fell from the gutters, ticking against the window like a broken clock. Ethan hadn't moved from the porch. Lily stood near the doorway, arms crossed, wet hair clinging to her face. I felt caught between two ghosts who were still alive. "Let's end this," I said. No more guessing. I set my laptop on the table, connected the speakers, and loaded both files, the original cassette and the clean digital one. Two versions of our father, two truths fighting for air. The first click of play filled the room. Dad's voice, real fragile, rose through static. "Don't let this house divide you." Then from the other file, the same words, but smoother, younger, almost holy. "Don't let this house divide you. The house belongs to the one who cared for it." Hearing them overlap was unbearable, like watching someone repaint your memories while you stood helpless. The human warmth bled out, replaced by digital perfection. Lily covered her ears. "Stop it," Ethan shouted. "It's not fake, I just made it clearer." "Clearer," I said. "You turned him into code." I gave him a voice again by taking his real one away. He slammed his hand on the table. "You think I wanted this? I was trying to prove something." "To who?" "To him." His voice cracked. He looked older all of a sudden, like the guilt had been aging him in secret. "When he died, Ethan said, you two got the memories. I got the debt. I paid the taxes, the repairs, the insurance. I thought maybe if I could just make him say it, people would finally see I wasn't the selfish one." Lily stepped closer. "You wanted Dad to bless you. I wanted him to forgive me." "For what?" "For leaving. For not being here when he fell." He pressed his palms against his eyes, shaking. "I downloaded samples from the old tapes, asked that guy online to restore them, but I told him what to make clearer, what to add. I only asked for one sentence, just one. And when I heard it, it felt right." "Right," Lily whispered. "You made him say something he never said. Ethan's hands dropped. He should have said it. The room went quiet. Outside the lake, wind sighed through the trees like someone breathing through tears. I opened the spectral view on my laptop, showing them both the overlapping patterns, the synthetic frequencies, glowing blue, beside the organic yellow waves of Dad's real voice. "See this?" I said. "That's where the algorithm starts. That's where he stops." Ethan stared at it, face blank. "Looks like he's fading," he murmured. "No," I said. "You just replaced him." He sank into a chair, head in his hands. "I just wanted to make the truth louder," he said softly. Instead, I said, "You muted it." Lily knelt beside him, trembling. "We could have remembered him together." He laughed once, bitter. "You wouldn't have listened, neither did you." Silence stretched between us, long, raw, almost sacred. I hit play one last time. From the cassette came Dad's real voice, thin but steady. "If you must lie, make sure love is what you're lying for." Ethan looked up, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. He whispered, "That's what I did." "No," I said. "You lied for guilt." He didn't argue. He just stared at the floor, breathing in sync with the hiss of the tape until it stopped. For the first time, he looked like the brother I remembered, the one who wanted to fix things instead of win them. I saved both files under a new name, Two Truths. Lily asked, "What are you going to do with it?" "Keep it," I said. "Unedited." She nodded, wiping her face. Ethan didn't move. He sat there whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe an apology. The sound was barely there, but I recorded it anyway. Because someday, someone will ask what guilt sounds like, and I'll have proof. If your proof hurts the ones you love, would you still defend it? Morning came without light. The sky was the color of damp concrete, and the house smelled like dust and rain-soaked wood. The storm had passed, but everything inside still dripped gutters, pipes. Grief. I sat in the basement with the recorder running, capturing the sounds no one else would. The hum of the furnace, the soft creak of the ceiling as it dried, the slow, steady rhythm of water tapping through the cracks in the wall. Each sound felt like proof that the house was still alive, even if we weren't sure what that meant anymore. For hours, I just listened. No words, no voices, just the aftermath. I used to think silence was absence, but Dad was right. Silence was sound. You just had to learn how to hear it. Upstairs, the piano stayed untouched, one broken note waiting for fingers that would never press it again. I recorded it too, the stillness around it, the breath before nothing. Ethan had packed most of his things by then. He didn't speak when he passed me on the stairs, just placed his key on the banister and kept walking. The front door opened, then closed, leaving only the echo of his steps fading into the gravel outside. Lily left a day later. She said she needed air that didn't smell like memories. She kissed my cheek, whispered, "Take care of the house," and drove off before I could answer. And then it was just me. Me and the hum, me and the ghosts. I walked through each room with the recorder still rolling. The living room sighed with every gust of wind. The kitchen ticked from the old clock Dad never fixed. Every sound had weight now. Every echo carried the shape of someone who used to fill it. When I reached the hallway by the piano, I sat down and pressed the lowest key. The sound was dull, flat, imperfect. But it was ours. I thought about Dad's words. That wrong note makes the music human. He'd been right about that too. Maybe the house wasn't broken. Maybe we were just off key. That afternoon, I found one of Dad's old notebooks on the shelf. Inside were sketches of microphones, diagrams of frequency curves, and one line written across the margin in his uneven hand. Love and guilt share the same frequency. You can only tell them apart by the silence between. I didn't understand it as a kid. But now, after everything, it made perfect sense. Ethan's guilt had sounded almost like love, loud, desperate, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. And mine wasn't much different. I'd wanted to believe the perfect version too, the clean, digital, easy one. Maybe that was my sin, wanting Dad to sound unbroken. I listened again to the Two Truths file. Both tracks played at once, the real and the artificial. They started in harmony, then began to drift apart. One voice aged, the other stayed young. By the end, they were no longer father and son, but faith and doubt. I turned off the recorder and just sat there, staring at the piano. The silence afterward was so full, it felt like a heartbeat. Maybe truth wasn't something you could clean. Maybe truth had to stay a little dirty, a little real. That night I dreamed of the lake house years ago, before everything cracked. We were all there younger. Dad was tuning the piano, humming under his breath. Lily laughed from the kitchen. Ethan argued about chords. I just listened. In the dream, Dad turned to me and said, "When people lie, they blink, but when they love, they breathe differently." I woke up before I could ask him what he meant, but I already knew. All week I'd been listening to our breaths. Ethan's guilt, Lily's sorrow, my hesitation, they all sounded like love trying to find the right pitch. I opened the window. The air outside smelled like pine and wet earth. The world had moved on without us, but the house still waited. Maybe that's what family does. It waits even when no one comes back. The next evening, I went through the tapes one last time. Some were labeled, most weren't, but one reel stood out, a small, unmarked one hidden at the bottom of a box. I threaded it through the deck and pressed play. At first, nothing. Then, a cough, a low chuckle, and Dad's real voice, weaker but calm. "If you're hearing this, it means you're still together." I laughed through tears. We weren't, not really, but maybe the house counted. Maybe it remembered what we forgot. I rewound the tape and let that single sentence loop over and over until it no longer sounded like instruction but forgiveness. Each repetition softer, slower, until it faded into the hum of the house itself. Before turning off the recorder, I whispered into the mic, "We're still here, Dad." Maybe that's enough. Then I stopped recording. For once, I didn't replay it, because some truths don't need to be edited. They just need to be heard. Would you forgive a lie if it was built from love? I thought I had heard every sound this house could make. The creaks, the rain, the echoes of old arguments, but that morning it found a new one. A faint rattle behind one of the basement shelves. When I pulled the box forward, a small tin container slid out and hit the floor. The label on top was faded but still legible. "Do not overwrite." Inside was a cassette wrapped in brittle tape, the reels fused slightly at the edges like it had been recorded over twice. Someone, probably Dad, had tried to save something that didn't belong to the rest. I cleaned the reels gently, threaded the tape through the old deck and pressed play. At first, only static. Then, a piercing feedback squeal followed by silence. I almost stopped it until a faint hum steadied the noise. Then came his voice. "Daniel, if you're hearing this, you fixed it." My breath caught. It wasn't the voice from the other tapes. This one was older, rougher, realer. He sounded tired but warm. "You were always listening harder than the others. You hear what people don't say. That's a gift and a burden." I sat down on the cold floor, holding my breath like it might disturb him. "One day you'll fix sounds for a living, but remember, silence fixes hearts. And when people lie, don't hate them for it. Sometimes they lie to stay loved." I covered my mouth. He had known. He'd recorded this long before we ever fought, long before guilt and inheritance twisted our voices into weapons. The tape clicked softly as it looped through a section of empty hiss. I heard faint laughter, Dad's laughter. He was talking to me again like he'd been waiting years for me to press play. "If the piano's still there, hit the broken note. That's the one that belongs to you." I stood up dizzy. The room spun with echoes of childhood dust motes dancing like old applause. Upstairs, the piano waited under its thin coat of dust. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. I brushed my hand across the keys. The middle D still hung limp, half a tone off. I pressed it once. It groaned, ugly and beautiful. Then I pressed it again. This time the vibration hummed against the walls, deep and warm, like the house had been waiting to breathe again. Rainwater dripped from the eaves outside, syncing perfectly with the rhythm. For a moment, everything in the room, airwood silence, felt tuned. And then I heard it. A voice faint between frequencies. Maybe memory. Maybe more. There it is. Perfectly wrong. I laughed through a tear. "Perfectly wrong," I whispered back. "Yeah, that sounds about right." For the first time, the wrong note didn't sound broken. It sounded true. I sat at the piano until the afternoon light turned gold. The lake outside was calm, glassy, reflecting clouds that moved too slowly to notice. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It just felt honest. When I went back to the basement, I rewound the tape and played it from the start again. This time I caught something I'd missed before, a faint background sound under his voice. It wasn't static. It was the sound of a pencil tapping against the table, the same rhythm Dad used whenever he was deep in thought. 4 taps, a pause, then 2, the same pattern he'd used to call us downstairs when dinner was ready. It hit me like a wave. He hadn't been recording a message for the future. He'd been recording a moment for himself, so he wouldn't forget us. And now, years later, I was hearing the proof that love doesn't disappear. It just changes frequency. I took out the cassette and labeled it again, carefully tracing the old letters, "Do not overwrite." That night, I sat by the piano with the window open. The wind carried the faintest hum from the lake, like the world was replaying something I'd finally learned to hear. I placed the recorder on the windowsill and whispered, "If you're listening, Dad, thank you." Then I pressed record and let the room fill itself. No talking, just breathing, just life. At some point, I must have fallen asleep sitting there, because when I woke, the sun had just broken over the lake. The tape had stopped spinning, but the silence it left was the most peaceful sound I'd ever heard. I played back the last few seconds, expecting nothing. But under the soft hiss, there was a faint echo. A voice nearly gone, "When one of you lies, remember the love that taught you to." I smiled. I remember I whispered. The piano creaked once as the morning light hit it. Somewhere in that sound, I could almost hear him smiling back. The sun rose higher, cutting through the mist above the lake until the water turned silver. I stood at the window, holding the tape like it might crumble if I blinked. All week I'd been chasing truth like it was something clean, something that could be proven. But now, staring at the label, "Do not overwrite," I understood what Dad meant. He wasn't talking about the tape. He was talking about us. Some things shouldn't be replaced, even the broken parts. I walked outside barefoot, the boards cold under my feet. The air smelled like cedar and wet leaves. From the porch, the lake looked endless, flat, patient, forgiving. I thought of Ethan somewhere on the road carrying his guilt like luggage, of Lily driving toward a life that didn't echo anymore, and of Dad, whose voice had stopped years ago but somehow still filled every inch of silence I knew. I took out my recorder and pressed record one last time. The wind brushed across the mic, soft and uneven. I spoke quietly, like confessing to the water. "Dad, you were right. We did let the house divide us, but it also brought us back." I let the recorder keep running, catching the wind, the birds, the distant hum of a world that didn't need editing. Maybe one day someone will find this file, play it, and hear nothing special, just air noise, maybe a single breath. But I'll know what it really is. The sound of letting go. 3 days passed before anyone came to the house. I thought the story was over, that the tapes would just sit in the drawer collecting dust like everything else we couldn't face. But that morning, a pair of unmarked sedans pulled up by the driveway. 2 detectives stepped out, one older one young enough to call me sir. They said they'd received a request from the state cyber unit, something about a flagged file in an AI forensics case. Apparently, the same freelancer Ethan had used had been caught producing synthetic evidence for other clients, and our family's tape, the clean version, was one of them. I led them inside. The house smelled of old pine and rain. They unpacked their equipment, scanning the digital files, the cassette reels, even the audio deck. While the machines hummed, I stood by the piano, tracing the scratches Dad had left on its surface. It felt like ghosts were holding their breath. The older detective asked, "You're Daniel Miller, right? The one who found the AI edit?" I nodded. He exchanged a look with his partner. "Then you should know the request to create that fake audio didn't come from a random freelancer." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned the tablet toward me. There, under the metadata chain, was an order record, an invoice linked to an encrypted email. The client's name read E. Miller, Ethan, timestamped the night before our argument. My stomach dropped. Even after the confession, part of me had wanted to believe he hadn't meant to, that maybe guilt had driven him too far, but not that far. "Where is your brother now?" the detective asked. "Somewhere east, I think. He left a week ago. Would you like to press charges?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the lake shimmered under a gray sky, still heavy, unblinking. I could hear the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock upstairs. Every sound felt louder than the question itself. I looked at the piano, at the recorder, at the tape still labeled "Do not overwrite," and for the first time I realized what that meant. It wasn't a warning about technology, it was a plea about forgiveness. I took a breath. "No," I said quietly. "I won't." The younger detective frowned. You understand, he tampered with evidence. I understand, I said, but I also understand why. They stared at me for a long moment before packing up their gear. The older one nodded slightly like he'd seen this kind of mercy before. Sometimes, he said, truth doesn't need another witness. When they left, the silence folded back over the house. I sat down at the piano again, the same key, waiting perfectly wrong. I pressed it once just to feel the vibration, and in that single note I heard everything, the storm, the lies, the love. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was peace. That night I got a voicemail. It was Ethan. His voice cracked with static. Dan, they called me. Said they found out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to hear him again. I thought if I made him say it, maybe I'd stop hearing the last words we spoke before he died. He paused, breathing hard. Do you still have the real tape? I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. He just whispered, keep it safe. I'm sorry. Then the line went quiet. I replayed it twice, listening not to the words but to the silence between them. The same silence Dad once said could fix hearts. And I realized something cruel and kind all at once. Dad had been right. Lies can destroy you, but sometimes they're just love wearing a broken voice. The next morning, I mailed the cassette to Lily with a note. Play this when you're ready. It's not about truth anymore, it's about us. Then I sat on the porch watching the fog rise off the lake. The house hummed quietly behind me, the same hum it had always carried, steady, forgiving, alive. I turned on the recorder one last time and whispered, when the world forgets our voices, maybe this will remind them what guilt sounds like. I left it recording as I walked toward the water barefoot again, feeling the boards sigh beneath me. For once, I didn't look back. The sound of the door closing behind me was soft, almost kind, like the house itself was exhaling. Somewhere in the static of the morning air, I imagined Dad's voice again. Don't let this house divide you. I smiled. It didn't. Dad, I whispered. It kept us together. The recorder clicked once, then fell silent. If this story made you feel something, maybe a memory, maybe a silence you haven't visited in a while, tell me what you heard between the lines. Would you have forgiven Ethan? Would you have kept the tape or destroyed it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories where truth and love collide, please like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal, and share it with someone who still believes that every voice, no matter how broken, deserves to be heard. Thank you for watching.